Well, history buffs, here we go. We're going to talk about World War II. We're going to continue talking about the trench life, and we're going to talk about the new weapons that are being used in World War II. If you remember from yesterday's PowerPoint, we talked about the First Battle of the Marne and how French and Germans were at a stalemate and they dug trenches throughout the French countryside. We're going to continue talking about that. We're going to look at the trench life. We're going to talk about how many trenches were dug and how many miles, and we're going to look at all the new weapons that are going to be used during and throughout World War One. So here we go. Trench warfare. Well, trench warfare was a major part of World War One. It is basically how the war was fought. It is exactly what it means, fighting from the trenches. Trenches were dug so that they were probably 7 or 8 feet high, and men would live in those trenches throughout the war. So the military officials thought that they would be able to capture the enemy very, very easily doing this through trench warfare, because this is something new that is being used on a wide scale. But in the end, they were wrong. So, throughout Europe, there were 400 miles of trenches from the North Sea through Switzerland. It covered most of Western Europe, mostly through France. The machine guns that are being used in the war are going to be pointed at the enemy's trenches, so that anytime somebody's helmet or head would pop up over the edge of their trench or even their rifle, the enemy or the other group, the other army, my bad, would begin firing at that particular area, trying to hit and kill them. Trench warfare is not a pleasant way to fight, especially since the majority of the fighting meant you had to get up out of your trench and run across no man's land. So basically, soldiers would leave the safety of their trenches. They would climb up out as a group and then run across what is known as no man's land. Their objective was to get to the other side and attack the army that was sitting in the trench. If you look at the picture on the right, you can see that no man's land is fairly wide open. You can't really see the barbed wire in that picture. There may not actually be barbed wire in that picture, but you can see that they've dug out gullies in the ground that soldiers would have to navigate through or over. You would have to navigate through barbed wire. So no man's land was not a place to be, and while you are crossing no man's land, you are being shot at with a machine gun that can shoot 600 bullets a minute at you. So you basically were risking your life to be shot down as you ran across no man's land, and you were praying that you got to the other side without being seriously injured. If you got injured in no man's land, there was nobody to come get you. So if you got shot but were not shot and killed, you were basically laying out in the middle of no man's land on your own, because nobody was willing to get up out of the trench to come help you for fear that they would be shot down as well. Usually, as I said before, you were shot down by the enemies using the machine gun fire. You were carrying a rifle, so your rifle was no match for the machine guns that were firing at you as you ran across no man's land. So this was not an effective way to fight. This is how the majority of the war was fought. That's why for most of the time it was at a stalemate, is because that both sides were doing the exact same thing and getting absolutely nowhere. Trench life. Well, life in the trenches was not pleasant for anybody at all. Both sides were suffering. All soldiers had to live with rats. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I said rats. You are living with rats, and you are going to live with lice, because you cannot shower. There were no showers in in the trenches. This was not something you were able to go do on a daily basis. It may have been weeks or even months before you had a shower. So a lot of disease, rats, and lice were living with you in those trenches. In addition to that, you would get trench foot. Those trenches were just big holes in the ground, so when it rained or it snowed, the water would pile up in the trench and your feet would get wet. Trench foot is where basically your foot swells. It's not getting dry because you have no clean socks or dry shoes to put your feet in. You are constantly living with wet feet. I'll have a picture here in a little bit to show you what an example of trench foot is. Because soldiers could not keep their feet dry, it has extended. Now you, in your packs, make sure that you have a dry pair of socks or even a change of shoes. So that is something that came out of World War I that most soldiers prepare for now on. In addition to those three things, you were living with blood, mud, because it was wet and it was dirty and it was gross. You were also dealing with the loss of life of your friends or your buddies that were with you in the army, going up and over into no man's land and attempting to go after the enemy, the Germans or the French or the British. So there was a lot of loss of life throughout World War I. As if you remember yesterday, 15,000 soldiers a day were dying for the French because of the lack of weaponry and the fact that there was no way to preserve life at this point. Everybody was shooting to kill. In addition, there was very little food for soldiers. Most soldiers were not getting any sleep. There was no comforts, such as a bed for you to sleep in. You had to make do with what you had, and you were living in constant fear of being attacked by the other side. Here are some pictures. As you can see, men were living in water, so it must have just rained in that picture. They were trying to get through dealing with that. The top right picture is an example of trench foot. This is what would happen to your feet if they are constantly wet day in and day out. And then in the bottom picture, you can see someone sleeping, somebody probably writing a letter home to their family. You can see the barbed wire back out in no man's land and the rifles that they have. So here's just a little insight into what trench life is for the soldiers and what they had to deal with throughout the war. Okay, now we're going to talk about the weapons of World War I. There are 6 weapons we're going to talk about, and then we'll look at some pictures and a video, and we will be done for the evening. The first weapons we're going to talk about, obviously, are going to be the machine guns. The machine guns were developed by the Germans. They could fire 600 bullets per minute, and they were extremely effective on the battlefield and for the Germans until everybody else decided to start using and purchasing machine guns. Then they became a defensive weapon just to use for those soldiers that were running across no man's land towards them. The second weapon we're going to talk about are the artillery field guns. These are the long-range cannons which cause more casualties than any other weapons because they do not actually have to be on the battlefield but could be behind the battlefield and would shoot towards the trenches, and if there were massive amounts of people or large amounts of people, they could hit a lot with one cannon as it would go by. Next will be the poison gas. Gases such as chlorine, phosgene, mustard gas would kill, blind, or burn their victims. The Germans came up with the gases. They were the first ones to start using them in the war. Using gas was extremely risky. If you think about it, all the fighting was done outside. What would happen if a wind would blow? Well, they were letting the gas off, so it was risky to use the poison gas because if you let the gas out and all of a sudden the wind changed direction, you could be the one being gassed instead of your enemies. So it was being used, but it was a risky measure to use poison gas. Chlorine gas would burn soldiers' lungs, so that was not a pleasant gas to be hit with. If you could see the color of the gas coming towards you, you would try and get your gas mask on as quickly as possible so that you would be okay from the gases. If you could not get your gas mask on quickly, usually it was a slow and painful death for you. The British and the French would also begin using gas masks and gases against the Germans, but none of the gas never had an effect on the outcome of battles. It was not effective as I think they hoped it would be. Next up would be the submarines. These are the German U-boats that they were using. They were using torpedoes to shoot down and shoot British ships who were taking supplies back and forth to France for the war effort. If the Germans thought that there might be any kind of war supplies on it, they shot it down, no questions asked. So that was causing a lot of problems in the North Sea and around Great Britain and the Atlantic, because the Germans were taking out ships that may or may not have had weapons on them for war, which angered a lot of people. Next up are the tanks and the armored cars. They tried to, the British developed these. The idea was that they could go over any type of land and rough ground. They could get through the barbed wire barricades, and they would be protection against those crossing no man's land from the machine gun fire. When they first used them in the first battle, 18 out of the 48 that they used got stuck in the mud, so basically ineffective. They have obviously changed and improved these tanks and armored cars to what we use today. So during World War I, they were used, but it was a limited success. They did scare the Germans when they first used them, but the Germans came up with a way to shoot at the armored cars or the tanks and actually destroy them. So initially they were a success. Further into the war, not so much, because Germany came up with a way to actually blow them up. So moving on, the last but not least will be the airplanes. We know the airplanes were used for reconnaissance, finding out where the trenches were of the enemies, making notes as to where they would drop heavy items onto the enemies, because they didn't have bombings at the beginning of the war when they started using the planes. So they would drop bricks and other heavy items onto their enemies from the planes. Eventually, they would figure out how to attach the machine guns to the airplanes, and they would use the airplanes as an attack mode and a way to drop bombs on the enemy's trenches and kill large amounts of people. And finally, they would use them in the dogfights between the British and the German up in the air. So now fighting is not only happening on the ground, it's happening in the air as well. So technology has come a long way. It continued to develop throughout World War I, and we know that this type of warfare has never been used. The amount of casualties that happened throughout World War I were devastating. A generation of men was lost throughout Europe, especially in France, where the majority of the fighting was done throughout World War I. All of this new technology was developed, but it didn't give either side an advantage to win the war. So, we will talk about later how the tide of the war will change when the United States will get involved. And more pictures of weapons. Here are the gas masks that soldiers would wear throughout the war, the hand pistol, the tanks, and then the Americans would eventually bring in the handguns towards the end of the war. Okay, this brings us to the conclusion of this PowerPoint. You need to go back to Class Jump and post a question that you may have had about tonight's PowerPoint that we can use to discuss in class tomorrow. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you tomorrow in class.